In the secular university today, it is often taken for granted that religion is irrelevant to the intellectual project, and that as time goes by and more of the world becomes educated and modern, fewer people will take religious belief seriously. Religion is a cultural artifact which informs the clothes we wear and the kind of food we eat, but it has little to do with questions of fundamental truth. New atheist public intellectuals like Richard Dawkins see belief in God as delusion, and the Enlightenment Project as the beginning of a great awakening as the human race goes beyond its deluded religious roots. From this perspective, religious believers are on the wrong side of history. But how does this meta-narrative square with empirical evidence? Is the world becoming more secular as it becomes more modern? Or has secularization, ironically, turned out to be the delusion? Peter Berger is Professor Emeritus of Religion, Sociology, and Theology at Boston University and is widely regarded as one of the greatest living sociologists of religion. With over 75 published books, Peter Berger has revolutionized the field of sociology. His most recent publication, The Many Altars of Modernity Toward a Paradigm for Religion in a Pluralist Age, draws on decades of research and reflects on the relationship between modernity and religion. It explores the implications of the growing realization that secularization theory, or the widely held belief that global modernization would lead to a decline in religion, is in fact empirically untenable. In its place, Peter Berger offers a new paradigm through which to understand religion in the modern age. We will begin the evening with opening remarks from Peter Berger.
Good evening. What I propose to do this evening is to introduce to you what, Kristen used the term paradigm, which sounds like a megalomaniac term. It simply means a way of looking at things. And over the last few years, no single individual can do that. Over the last few years, I, together with some colleagues, both in this country and in Europe, have been working on a new way of looking at the relationship of religion and modernity. Maybe totally false, but I think it's interesting, and I happen to think it's empirically valid. Well, I don't have very much time to do this. This is a very Japanese-oriented evening. Every 5 minutes seem to be programmed. And I told Miss Kim, that I would ignore the time limits if I have to, but I'll try to keep roughly, with being a polite person, roughly within the time limit I was given. But let me put it this way. Einstein succeeded in putting his theory in one mathematical formula. I can't do that. Luther needed 95 theses to start the Reformation. By the way, the 500th anniversary of the nailing of the 95,000 theses on the castle door of Wittenberg comes next year. By the way, there was no castle door, but let's not go into this. It's a nice image, nailing these. It happened to be the university bulletin board, and he was really putting down what he wanted to do in the following semester. He didn't know what the effect would be. Well, I'm not going to put 95 theses before you. That will keep you here way beyond your bedtime. What I will do is I will try to sum up what I have to say on this topic in 6 theses. 4 of them are social scientific theses, and basically are the result of our work on what we still call a new paradigm, although I assure you this is not meant in some megalomaniac sense. Since this is a Christian organization that is sponsoring this, I don't know if Memorial Church, or for that matter the Harvard Divinity School, still considers itself Christian. But since these are the auspices, my last 2 theses have to do with what I think, from a Christian point of view, one can say about the empirical picture that the first four theses paint. Okay, I think that's enough by way of introduction. Thesis number one, and that is where I'm afraid I run right up against what some of you probably think. The thesis is very simple, but has far-reaching implications. Contrary to what many people think, we don't live in a secular age. We live in a pluralist age, which is a very different story. The distinguished Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor wrote a book with the title The Secular Age a few years ago. It's the biggest book I've ever tried to read. It's over 800 pages. And some of it is quite interesting. He's a very competent philosopher, but already the title of the book is wrong. We don't live in a secular age. Most of the world is more religious than it ever was. The exceptions really, not the United States. The United States is still a very religious country. It may not seem that way from the perspective of Harvard Yard, but most of the country is very religious still, despite what some misleading survey data have told you recently. You have to look at who these nuns are, with no religious affiliation, what they really are. They're not militant atheists at all. No, the exception to the statement that the world is very religious, there's a geographical exception, which is basically Europe, with some outliers like Australia, New Zealand perhaps. And there is an international intelligentsia, which is secular. But most of the world isn't secular at all. But it's pluralist, and that makes an enormous difference. I now use the term two pluralisms. I will explain the second term in a moment, but the first meaning of pluralism is what in everyday language one calls pluralism. Many different religions operating more or less at peace within the same society. If they exist in the same society and kill each other or never talk to each other, that's not pluralism. But in much of the world today, this coexistence is relatively peaceful, and people talk to each other. That's the basic pluralism, the plurality of religions. Then there is something where the old secularization theory, the people who believed the more modern, the more secular the world will be, were not completely wrong. There is a secular space, and that's the other pluralism, is the interaction between religious discourses and the discourse, the secular discourse, without which a modern society could not exist. Now, the religious pluralism is obvious. Hare Krishnas are chanting and dancing in front of medieval cathedrals in Europe. I was once disturbed a few years ago. I was having lunch with the Archbishop of Vienna, and we didn't know this noise came overlooking the cathedral. It was Hare Krishnas dancing. South Korean businessmen who are also Protestant missionaries smuggled Bibles into China and Central Asia. There are now about 16 million Muslims within the European Union. They are growing by several thousand as we talk. The estimate now is there are about 100 million Christians in China, which is slightly more than members of the Communist Party, and so on and so forth. And the United States, for historical reasons which are not difficult to explain, has been in the vanguard of religious pluralism. And that has been sanctified, as it were, by the American Constitution. And the combination of pluralism, which is a fact, and religious freedom, which is a legal value, is dynamic. And the United States expresses that dynamism very vividly, and I would say on the whole, rather successfully. Now, I'm still speaking as a sociologist. I'm not saying whether this is good or bad. I'm speaking, as it were, from behind the antiseptic mask of social scientific objectivity. But there are enormous consequences of pluralism. I'm talking about the first pluralism, in terms of individual faith, in terms of religious institutions, and in terms of the state, finally. In terms of individual faith, what pluralism does is it undermines the taken for grantedness of any religious tradition. Because there are all these other people with whom you constantly rub shoulders who don't believe and don't practice what you believe for very basic psychological reasons that will influence you. And one thing it does, you can no longer take for granted where you happen to be born in terms of religion. Secondly, it changes the nature of religious institutions. Whether they like it or not, and some of them don't like it at all, they become voluntary associations. It changes the relationship between clergy and lay people. The laity gains power, they become consumers. The clergy can't use the police to fill the pews, they have to persuade people to come in and to stay in. And it changes the nature of the state, because all this plurality has to be managed politically if it isn't to explode. So the enormous consequences to pluralism, not secularity, not secularism, but pluralism, which is creating these big changes. Now, in terms of taken for grantedness, I read somewhere that in ancient Greece, when two strangers met somewhere, they asked each other, "What are your gods?" The contemporary equivalent would be to ask for your zip code or your area code. If you could answer who your gods were, you would know where the person came from. That is no longer the case. Okay, I don't have to expand on this. But it's not only individuals that change, it's religious institutions that change, that become voluntary and that are in competition with other institutions of the same kind. Richard Dawkins, the American church historian, said the peculiar American contribution to sociology of religion, or concepts of religion, is the denomination, which he defined as a church which recognizes de facto or de jure the right of other churches to exist. And ecumenism is the polite expression of this new relationship. Well, I will not go on taken for grantedness, although I could talk way beyond my allotted time to just talk about that first thesis. What does it mean that religion is no longer taken for granted? Any religion, any religious tradition. Fundamentalism, by the way, can be explained as a project to revoke that loss of taken for grantedness, to restore either an old or a new unanimity on worldviews. It's very difficult to do. And you have to set up a totalitarian society that controls all communications. And the good news of the 20th century, not many good news from the 20th century, is that's very difficult to do unless you want to completely isolate yourself from the world economy and world communications. Voluntary association. I said whether you like it or not. The most interesting and, I think, instructive example of a religious institution, in this case a church, Christian church, that has very successfully related to the loss of taken for granted. This is the Roman Catholic Church. There are almost exactly 100 years between the First and Second Vatican Council. The First Vatican Council was called by Pius IX, author of the Syllabus of Errors. He had some 80 errors that the Pope must never accept. And then the basic idea was the Roman Catholic Church has the truth. The truth has the right to proclaim itself publicly, but error in principle has no rights. It may be permitted out of necessity or out of good-heartedness, but error has no rights. The truth has rights, and we have the truth. Vatican II, as you know, I think I would say its most, at least for non-Catholics, most remarkable contribution is the Declaration on Religious Freedom, which defined religious freedom as a fundamental human right, not for Catholics, but for all religious people and for those who have no religion. It's an enormous change, and the Roman Catholic Church has never been the same since then. And that process of accommodation to pluralism and to religious freedom is still going on very powerfully. Okay, first thesis, not secularism, not secularity, but pluralism. Secondly, pluralism undermines taken for grantedness of any religious tradition. Third thesis, churches become voluntary associations. All religious groups become voluntary associations, especially in America. Take Judaism. Judaism, after all, has been the religion of a people. Say in Eastern Europe, when you had these little Jewish communities in Russia and elsewhere, to be a Jew was a destiny. It's not a destiny anymore, certainly not in America. It's a choice. And how you count it, there are at least 4 and maybe more Jewish denominations. If you count the different Hasidic sects, there are even more. And there's an American Jewish joke which expresses this perfectly. An American Jew is stranded on a desert island, all by himself, and he builds 2 synagogues, one in which he prays and the other in which he never wants to be seen or caught dead in. That's denominationalism. And that's increasing all over the world. Not because of American influence, but because similar conditions appear all over the world. That was number 3. Number 4, let me say a couple of things about the secular space. When I started out as a sociologist of religion, which as some of you know was the year of Lincoln's second inaugural, I believed in secularization theory because everyone else did. It wasn't crazy. There were some good reasons for it. Its basic proposition was very simple: the more modern, the less religious. Okay? It took me about 25 years to conclude that this was a mistake. It was empirically untenable because of what I said in my first thesis. The world is not becoming ever more secular. The world is becoming, or not becoming, remains strongly religious. But where secularization theory wasn't completely wrong, and where, by the way, Taylor's book is still quite interesting to read, even if you don't accept the implication of the title. Every modern society needs a secular space. The basic reason for this is science and technology. You cannot have a modern society without at least a minimum of technology. My favorite method of thinking is free association. And I mentioned Judaism, let me mention a Jewish example that comes to mind that landed in my notes. I know a very successful Jewish surgeon in Boston. He's a practicing Orthodox Jew, I guess modern Jewish in terms of the Jewish denominationalism. In fact, he wears a yarmulke in his office. And he's a very, very nice man. His patients love him. He's very warm. He's a mensch, as they say in Yiddish. And I think it has something to do with his religion. He regards his vocation, I don't know him very well, but his vocation as a mandate for every pious Jew to help in the repair of the universe, which has many flaws, and human beings can help correct those flaws. But when he enters the operating room, you couldn't tell whether he wears a yarmulke because he has this cap on, and everything he does must be by a strictly secular discourse. And his being a practicing Jew is irrelevant. If he has a problem in the course of the surgery, he cannot consult the Talmud. He has to operate exactly as if he were a Buddhist or a Presbyterian or an atheist or whatever. Secular discourse. It's not only, well, the hospital is a temple of modernity, but let's not go into this. We recently had a fascinating conference on that at BU. But it's constantly infiltrated by religion. Hospital chaplains visiting clergy and relatives, patients who pray, nurses who have prayer circles, medical faculties who are interested in alternative healing methods, which usually are either from India or from China. It's not isolated from religion. It interacts with religion. And I think this is very important to understand. I recently came on the writings of a famous Dutch jurist of the 17th century, Hugo Grotius, one of the founders of modern international law. And he wrote that his new discipline was to be handled as if God did not exist. Now, that was not a statement of philosophical atheism, it was a methodological statement. Grotius himself was a pious Protestant. He was an Arminian, which I would call the more humane version of the Dutch Reformation. And he was kicked out of the newly independent Netherlands by the Calvinists who were then in charge. But international law was not going to be based on his religion. It couldn't be. By the time he wrote, European states, some defined themselves as Catholic, some as Protestant, Anglican, Lutheran, Calvinist. Then you had Orthodox Russia, and you had the Ottoman Empire. International law that would be applicable to all of them would have to be religiously neutral. Couldn't be any particular religion. But it expanded into other areas of life, certainly expanded in domestic law. An American judge who operates under state law or under federal law has whatever his religion or lack of religion may be, he cannot apply it to the case which he's supposed to judge. He has to bracket his religion. He operates in secular space. That secular space also has to be managed. And what has to be managed is the dividing lines between religious spaces and the secular space. And in the United States today, there are constant litigation. Well, America is the most litigational society on earth. People constantly sue each other. It's a national pastime. I'm still looking for somebody plausible to sue. I haven't found one. Deep pockets, probably. So the secular space is very important, and in itself, it can become a foundation of religious freedom, because religious freedom is a prerogative. It's a very efficient way of handling both pluralisms. Let me then say again something that goes against what many people think. Religion and secularity, for most people who are religious, is not a question of either or. It's a question of both and. And you don't have to travel very far from where we are now to experience this every day. For the last few years, I periodically taught at the Baptist University in Texas. And there you meet people who are intensely religious, but are as modern as you can get. Petroleum engineers, brain surgeons, you name it. It's not either or, it's both and. Sometimes there are tensions, sometimes there are not. According to my allotted time, I have about 5 minutes left. I think I probably can do it in 5 minutes. And now I will take off my surgical mask and put on my theological hat. I usually describe myself as incurably Lutheran, but it's not the Lutheranism of the Missouri Synod. It's a very open-minded and undogmatic Lutheranism, which is not my job to explain to you tonight. One thing I want to emphasize, my change of mind about secularization theory had nothing to do with my own personal faith. It had to do with how I read empirical evidence. And I was not the only one. Most sociologists of religion have come to the same conclusion. There are some who hold out, and I admire them. I admire people who don't follow the herd, wherever the herd is going. But they're a very small minority now. Okay, 2 more theses I promised you, and they are not sociological, they are theological theses. And they're Christian theological theses. Although other religions may very well put their own spin on them. Well, let me put in a commercial here. My own take on what this whole means, I put in a book called The Many Altars of Modernity, published in the US and in Germany simultaneously in English last year. The Many Altars of Modernity. I have, over the years, lots of experience, acquired a deep respect for African culture, its wisdom and its wit. So I will quote here my favorite Zulu proverb, which says, "If I don't beat my own drum, who will?" So I mentioned my book, which is readily available. Okay, two more theses, which are not sociological but theological. Both say the same thing. Pluralism is good for you if you're a person of faith. Don't be afraid of it. Why is it good for you? Well, one thing is because it puts us right into the position of the early Christians. The world into which Paul carried the gospel, an obscure Jewish sect in Palestine, was highly pluralistic, especially in its cities. Just think of Apostle Paul's famous sermon in Athens, where he talked about the many altars in Athens. Why should we deplore the situation which saw the beginnings of the Christian religion? I think the situation allows us a new understanding of faith. Faith is not knowledge. Preachers often present the antithesis faith and lack of faith, and lack of faith is some kind of sin. I think it's very misleading. The opposite of faith is not lack of faith, it's knowledge. I think I know that I'm right now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and not in Vienna, where I come from, or Washington, where I was last week. I know this, although a philosophy student may try to explain to me that how do I really know this? Maybe I'm just imagining this, I'm dreaming. You don't exist, you're a dream. I do know it. I'm sure I know it. Religion, faith is not knowledge. Faith is a trust in something that I don't know. And that has very interesting implications. It was very much the reason why the Reformation had the basic notion of we are saved by faith alone. Let me not go into this, not the context, we don't live in the 16th century, but I think that faith alone has a very important meaning for us today. If we are honest, most of us are agnostics. We don't know, we believe. It's not the same thing. And that means that faith always has around it a penumbra of doubt. And I think that's very good. It means that one can be free, not bound by tradition. One can be free and have trust in, well, in a Christian case, in what Jesus Christ tells us about the nature of God. And finally, my last thesis, I don't have 2 minutes, but I'll take maybe 4. I'm a very cooperative person. Why is it good for you, faith, pluralism? Because it forces you to distinguish between what is the core of your faith and what is marginal. When you are not completely sure of your faith, you begin negotiating with those who don't share it. What is non-negotiable, what is negotiable, and what isn't. That was a very real problem in the 19th century when modern biblical scholarship invaded Protestant theological faculties, first mainly in Germany and then all over the world. And it was impossible to hold onto the Bible the way most people still did, as a kind of absolutely certain document about truth. It became debatable what was marginal and what was core. The great Rabbi Hillel the Elder, who was one of the first big thinkers of rabbinical Judaism, once was asked, I think in mockery, could you explain the meaning of Torah while you stand on one leg? And he then uttered what as we know is the first statement of the Golden Rule. In his version, don't do unto others what you hate if it's done to you. I don't know if that was a good choice, but what could you say about Christianity standing on one leg? By the way, Hillel, I think, shouldn't have chosen the Golden Rule. He should have chosen the Shema, the basic Jewish confession of faith. Our God, the Lord is our God, and the Lord is one. A Muslim would have no trouble standing on one leg and pronouncing the Shahada. There's no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, his messenger. A Buddhist would have a little difficulty. He may have to do more than put the second leg down for a couple minutes. He could do it in 5 minutes. The Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. What could a Christian say? And I would say, and that was very much part of the negotiations in the 19th century and since then with modern biblical scholarship. I think the core proposition of the Christian gospel is Christ is risen. That is non-negotiable. Now, Hillel added, I should have said this before, after he stood on one leg, he put the other leg down and said, wonderful sentence, the rest is commentary. There are lots of questions about it. The rest is commentary. Well, there are lots of commentary we have to engage in terms of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Who is Jesus Christ to begin with? Why is his resurrection important? Was there an empty tomb? If there had been a police camera in the tomb, what would they have shown on Easter morning? Why is this important for us? What does it signify for the whole cosmos? I think there's nothing more glorious in celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ than the Eastern Orthodox liturgy. And the Eastern liturgy is an incredible climax of faith. A wonderful phrase, the risen Christ trampled death with death to bring life to those who are in the tomb. Christ is risen. I think that is non-negotiable, that is central. And Paul was quite right. He wrote in, was it 1st or 2nd Corinthians, I forget, if Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain. What about all the other miracles in the New Testament? Did Jesus walk on the Lake of Galilee? I have no idea. If he was what he said he was, or what I think he was, he could have. But if he didn't, if that somehow got into the Gospels, certainly I wouldn't feel that my faith is vain. It's negotiable. It may be, it may not be. The basic fact, the basic affirmation of resurrection is not. And with this I will end with a story. Take me less than a minute. I should have been in Japan, accustomed to such time frames. It's a story from the old Soviet Union, where occasionally the not much lamented Soviet Union, except by Mr. Putin, the party occasionally ran atheism campaigns, preaching the important truth of scientific atheism. And the story is that on one of those campaigns, an official of the party went to some village somewhere in Russia. All the villagers had to be assembled and to listen to a 1-hour lecture on scientific atheism and on the pernicious and foolish illusions of religion. And when he was finished, he said, we believe in free speech here. The hell they did, but that's what he said. The Orthodox priest, who was also had to be there, has 5 minutes to reply. The story is the priest went up in front, turned toward the assembled villagers, and said, he said to the commissar, I don't need 5 minutes. He turned to the assembled villagers and said, Christ is risen. And they replied with the proper liturgical formula, he is risen indeed.